The courtroom was so silent I could hear the ventilation system humming somewhere above the judge's bench. My younger brother, Daniel, leaned back in his chair the way a man does when he's already decided the game is over. He looked at me with a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that doesn't come from joy, the kind that comes from winning. "Enjoy your retirement, Margaret," he said quietly. A few heads in the gallery turned toward me. Then he added the part he had clearly been saving, the line he'd probably rehearsed in front of his bathroom mirror a dozen times. "Enjoy it without a house." That smile told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was satisfaction, pure, carefully cultivated satisfaction, the kind that only grows inside someone who has spent an entire lifetime competing against you. I looked at him for a long, measured moment. Then I smiled back. "Daniel," I said calmly, "you never finished reading the agreement." His attorney's head snapped up from the papers in front of him, so fast it looked like someone had pulled a string. "What did you just say?" I folded my hands on the table in front of me, without any urgency at all. Because the document Daniel had manipulated me into signing wasn't what he believed it was. And neither was the inheritance he had spent the better part of 8 months celebrating. But to explain that, I need to take you back to the week my father died. My name is Margaret Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I spent 26 years in the United States Navy and retired with the rank of commander. Most of my adult life was divided between ships, overseas bases, and offices where the margin for error was essentially zero. I learned 3 things from military service that most people never do. Genuine discipline, the specific kind of patience that outlasts almost everything, and the understanding that panic is a luxury you cannot afford when everyone around you is losing their composure. Those 3 lessons would eventually save me. At the time I needed them, though, I had no idea they were being called upon. My father, Gerald Calloway, died on a rainy Wednesday morning in Chesapeake, Virginia. The call arrived just after sunrise. I was sitting in my small townhouse outside Richmond, halfway through my first cup of coffee, when my phone lit up with Daniel's name. I already knew before I answered. Nobody calls a sibling that early in the morning with good news. "Dad passed away about an hour ago," Daniel said. His voice was strangely flat, not grief-stricken, not shaken, just informational, the way someone reports traffic conditions or a weather delay. Several seconds of silence passed between us. No matter how complicated a relationship with a parent might be, their death lands differently than you imagine. Even when you've spent years watching someone decline, even when the doctors have been preparing you with careful language and gentle warnings, when that call comes, something shifts inside you. Some ancient, wordless thing you didn't even know was load-bearing suddenly gives way. My father and I had never been particularly close. Gerald Calloway was a proud man, a hard man, the kind of man who believed that warmth encouraged weakness. Growing up, I spent years throwing everything I had at his approval. Academic records, athletic achievements, scholarship awards, military service. None of it seemed sufficient. Whatever I accomplished, it was never quite what he was looking for. Daniel had figured that out considerably earlier than I had. Rather than chasing approval he could never catch, Daniel learned to position himself near the source of it. He stayed in Chesapeake, worked nearby, dropped by the house regularly, had dinner with Dad every Sunday without fail. I, meanwhile, was stationed at bases scattered across the world. The distance between my father and me grew from geography into something more permanent. It became the default state of our relationship. Distance became habit. The funeral was held 4 days after his death. The church was genuinely packed. Former neighbors, old work colleagues, veterans group members, family friends who had known Gerald Calloway for 30 and 40 years. I sat in the second pew in a simple black dress. Many people approached me afterward. Several remembered things my mother had told them about my naval career, years before her death. My mother, Carol, had been the warm one, the person in our household who laughed easily and remembered everyone's birthday and made you feel welcome simply by being in a room. She'd passed away almost 20 years earlier. Sometimes I think our family began its slow unraveling on the day we lowered her casket. At the reception, something felt wrong to me. I couldn't name it precisely, but it sat in my chest like a splinter. Daniel moved through the gathering the way a politician works a room, shaking hands, collecting condolences, telling anecdotes, steering conversations. Several times I caught fragments of what he was saying to people. Everything's already been handled. Or, Dad took care of all the paperwork well in advance. The statements landed strangely against the backdrop of a funeral reception that hadn't ended yet. Most families were still absorbed in grief. Daniel sounded like a man discussing real estate. I noticed other people noticing it. Nobody said anything. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing alone near the church parking lot while a light rain began to fall. Daniel appeared beside me carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed me one without being asked. "For old time's sake," he said. We stood quietly for a moment, watching the remaining mourners filter toward their cars. Then he spoke again. "Dad simplified everything before the end. Probate shouldn't be too complicated." There was something rehearsed in the delivery, not quite natural, not quite spontaneous. A small, cold knot formed somewhere in my stomach. Not fear, just a warning signal I didn't yet have enough information to interpret. A week later, Daniel invited me to a meeting at his attorney's office. The lawyer's name was Stephen Granger. His office was in an older brick building downtown, nothing elaborate, nothing designed to impress. The meeting felt routine, at least initially. Stephen explained that my father had organized his estate documents over the preceding months. Several forms required signatures from both heirs. He presented this as standard procedure, something that would help avoid unnecessary delays in the probate process. I asked questions, some of them, not enough of them. That failure is one I've had to sit with. Grief makes people permeable. Even the most disciplined people, perhaps especially the most disciplined people, are vulnerable when they're exhausted and hollowed out, and just want the difficult things finished rather than prolonged. The stack of documents was substantial. Page after page after page. Dense legal language, property descriptions, trust references, transfer agreements, disclosure statements. Most of it sounded routine, even mundane. Daniel sat quietly beside me throughout the meeting, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering brief reassurances. "Just standard estate stuff, Margaret. Nothing unusual." Looking back, that's the part that stays with me most. Not the deception itself, the trust. I trusted my brother, not completely perhaps, but enough. And enough was all he needed. I signed every signature line, initialed every required space, worked through the entire stack from front to back. Then I drove home believing the estate paperwork had been properly handled and that I could begin processing my grief in peace. For a while, life settled back into something resembling ordinary. I worked in my garden. I volunteered at a veterans assistance center near Richmond. I had dinners with friends. Months passed with the particular quiet that follows major losses. Then an official envelope arrived in my mailbox. I opened it at my kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. By the time I reached the final paragraph, I felt something cold move through my chest like a tide going out. According to the estate records, Daniel now held ownership of nearly the entire Callaway estate, the family house, the lakefront property Dad had owned since the 1970s, multiple investment accounts, 3 rental properties, virtually every significant asset, all of it legally transferred, with my signature attached to every relevant document. I called Daniel immediately. He answered on the second ring, with a speed that suggested he'd been expecting the call. "You finally received the paperwork," he said. I stared out my kitchen window at the garden I'd been tending. "You manipulated me, Daniel." There was a pause, then a slow exhale. "No, Margaret, you signed everything voluntarily. You reviewed it right there at the table." "We both know that isn't what happened." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had gone hard. "Dad trusted me to handle things. That's been true our entire lives." That sentence hit harder than I expected, not because I believed it, because I had spent my entire childhood hearing variations of it. Daniel was dependable, Daniel stayed close, Daniel showed up, Daniel was the one Gerald could count on. I was always the one who left. I barely slept that night. Anger came and went in long, exhausting waves, and embarrassment came with it. 67 years old, 2.5 decades in the Navy, a career spent mastering complex operations and high-stakes decisions, and I'd been outmaneuvered at a conference table by my own younger brother, in a building I'd walked into willingly. At least, that was what I believed at the time. Several friends urged me to hire an attorney immediately. Some wanted me to go public. Others wanted me to sue Daniel, Stephen Granger, and anyone else within reach. I listened carefully to all of them. Then, I declined. Not because I was surrendering, because something felt wrong about the picture. Not emotionally wrong, structurally wrong. The situation was too clean, too perfectly arranged. Real life rarely achieves that kind of symmetry. Decades in military service had taught me to be suspicious of scenarios that look flawless, because flawless scenarios almost always have something hidden in them. Instead of responding, I requested certified copies of every document I had signed, every page, every attachment, every referenced exhibit. The package arrived 2 weeks later by courier. I spread everything across my dining room table and began reading. Not skimming, reading, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, section by section, starting from the beginning and working forward. Hours passed, my coffee grew cold. The night deepened around me. Near midnight, buried deep inside one of the transfer agreements, halfway through a subsection referencing something called the Callaway Family Revocable Trust, I encountered a paragraph I'd clearly passed over the first time. A paragraph that most people would pass over, because it sat between two sections of genuinely boring procedural language and was written in the kind of dense, unbroken legal prose, specifically designed to discourage careful reading. I stopped. I read it again. A third time. The language wasn't alarming on its surface. It simply stated that any beneficiary receiving transferred assets under this agreement would simultaneously assume all associated obligations, liabilities, personal guarantees, encumbrances, and financial responsibilities attached to those assets, in full and without limitation. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Not a proportional share, all. Something about that language reached back into my memory and tugged at something very specific. I stared at the ceiling for several minutes, following the thread. Then I remembered. 12 years earlier, my father had invited me to lunch during one of my increasingly rare visits home. We'd met at a seafood restaurant near the harbor. Lunch with Gerald Calloway was never exactly comfortable, but this particular afternoon had felt heavier than usual. Near the end of the meal, without any setup or warning, he'd mentioned a failed investment. Something involving commercial property development that hadn't gone the way he'd planned. He'd spoken with a frustration that was unusual for him, because my father rarely acknowledged financial difficulty to anyone, including family. What stayed with me now, surfacing out of a 12-year-old lunch, was one specific phrase he'd used. I had to put everything up as collateral, everything. The following morning, I found an old notebook where I occasionally recorded important family information. There, in my own handwriting from 12 years ago, Dad upset, commercial property venture, lake property pledged as collateral, possible refinancing issues. Just a few lines, but they were enough to make me curious. And curiosity, I had learned long ago, is one of the most dangerous things you can bring to a comfortable lie. Over the following weeks, I began investigating. Not feverishly, not emotionally, methodically. The same way I had approached financial audits and operational reviews throughout my military career. One document at a time, one verified fact at a time. No assumptions, no conclusions formed before the evidence was in. I visited the county records office. I spoke with clerks and requested public filings and worked through property records with the kind of patience that comes from years of professional paperwork. Most of the employees I encountered were friendly once they understood I wasn't hunting for ammunition. I was hunting for accuracy. What emerged was a portrait of my father's finances that I had never seen clearly before. Gerald Calloway had been a man of apparent wealth. Substantial property holdings, investment accounts, a visible lifestyle of quiet prosperity. But beneath the surface of that wealth, the architecture was considerably more complicated. Several loans had been secured over the years against various properties. Some were ordinary mortgage refinancing. Others were connected to business ventures that had quietly failed, commercial ventures that had consumed capital and generated losses that my father had never publicly acknowledged. Personal guarantees had been signed. Properties had been pledged as collateral. Some of those obligations had been refinanced repeatedly rather than retired, extended and restructured, and pushed forward rather than resolved. The outstanding amounts weren't ruinous in isolation. Combined, they were significant, and they were entirely absent from Daniel's celebration. Meanwhile, Daniel appeared to be thoroughly enjoying himself. Mutual acquaintances mentioned seeing him around Chesapeake in a new luxury vehicle. He'd begun talking about renovating the lake property. One mutual friend told me he'd described himself, at a dinner party, as the sole steward of the Callaway family legacy. That phrase made me laugh out loud. Not because it was absurd, because it sounded exactly like something my father would have said. One afternoon, my longtime friend Patricia stopped by carrying a casserole. People of a certain generation still do that. It's one of the things I genuinely love about reaching the age I've reached. She sat at my kitchen table while I organized papers and watched me with patient concern. "You're not filing a lawsuit?" she asked. "Not yet." She frowned. "Margaret, he took your inheritance." "Perhaps." "What does that mean?" "It means I don't have all the facts yet." Patricia looked at the towers of folders surrounding me. "That looks like plenty of facts to me." "We're nowhere close." Television has convinced most people that justice arrives dramatically and quickly. Real life operates through records offices and loan documents and property filings and tax records. Real justice lives inside boring details. Most serious mistakes happen because someone stopped paying attention to boring details. Daniel's mistake, I suspected, was hiding somewhere inside them. Then I found a name. An accounting firm that had done work for my father years earlier. The firm itself no longer existed, but after a series of phone calls, I located a retired accountant named William Bauer, who had worked there for 30 years. He agreed to meet me for coffee at a diner near the courthouse. William was 78 years old, sharp as a carpenter's chisel. The moment I mentioned Gerald Callaway's name, he took a slow breath. "There's a name I haven't heard in some years," he said. I showed him several of the public documents I'd gathered. He adjusted his reading glasses and studied them carefully. After several minutes, he set them down and looked at me. I wondered when this would eventually surface. My heartbeat quickened slightly. What exactly am I looking at? William tapped one page. "Your father spent years restructuring debt." "How much debt?" He hesitated. "Enough to keep him awake on a regular basis." William couldn't share client confidences. He was clear about that, and I respected it. But he could discuss what was already in the public record, and he did, with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades thinking in numbers. What emerged was a clarifying picture. My father's estate wasn't the treasure chest Daniel had assumed it was. It was more accurately described as a machine. A complicated, load-bearing machine in which assets and obligations were woven together so tightly that you couldn't extract one without disturbing the other. Driving home afterward, something finally clicked into place. Daniel had never examined what he'd actually inherited. He'd only examined what he believed he'd inherited. And those two things, I now understood with complete certainty, were very different. A few weeks after meeting William, a former employee of one of my father's old companies contacted me through a mutual connection. His name was Raymond Torres. We met at a small diner outside Chesapeake. Raymond brought a worn manila folder containing documents he had legally retained after the business folded. Most were unremarkable. One file, however, referenced personal guarantees attached to commercial loans, guarantees signed by Gerald Callaway, connected directly to properties that Daniel now owned. I thanked Raymond, drove home with the folder on the passenger seat beside me, and felt, for the first time since my father's death, something shifting in the weight of things. The strange truth about what people call revenge is that most people imagine it as an emotional experience. Confrontation, fury, the visible collapse of someone who wronged you. The reality is often much quieter. Sometimes it looks like standing completely still while someone accelerates toward a wall. You don't push them, you don't trip them, you simply choose not to warn them, and you wait. By late autumn, Daniel's confidence was in full bloom. He'd hired contractors at the lake property. He was discussing investment opportunities. He'd apparently told several people he was finally stepping into his full potential. I heard he'd started looking at boats. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The first creditor appeared 3 months after the hearing. I didn't witness it directly. I heard about it from a mutual acquaintance who'd been at the lake property that afternoon. Daniel had apparently been hosting a small gathering, some neighbors, a contractor reviewing renovation plans. In the middle of the afternoon, a representative from a financial institution arrived requesting documentation regarding the property's loan history. Daniel brushed him off, called it a clerical mix-up, and thanked him for his time. Laughed about it afterward, according to my acquaintance. He still believed at that point that he was the smart test person in any room he entered. A week later, another letter arrived, addressed to Daniel. I learned about it because my cousin Linda called, the way family members call when news is too strange to sit on. Evelyn, she said carefully, using my middle name the way she always does when she's about to say something delicate. Have you spoken to Daniel recently? No. A pause. Something seems wrong over there. What kind of wrong? He says creditors keep reaching out. I didn't want to pry, but he seemed shaken. I looked out my kitchen window at the autumn leaves beginning to release from the trees. What kind of creditors? He didn't say. Of course he didn't. People never discuss financial difficulty in plain language until the water is at their chin. By November, the situation appeared to be escalating in volume rather than intensity. Property notices, tax correspondence, loan servicing inquiries, documentation requests. Each one individually was manageable. The problem was accumulation. One letter can be dismissed. 12 letters become harder to rationalize. 20 letters become impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, I continued my quiet life. Tuesdays and Thursdays at the Veterans Center near Richmond, helping older veterans with paperwork, coordinating appointments, organizing records. The work kept me grounded. Many of the people who came through those doors had faced challenges that made an inheritance dispute feel embarrassingly small. Combat injuries, widowhood, poverty, profound loneliness. People whose lives had been genuinely broken by history. I was grateful for the perspective. One afternoon, a retired Marine named Harold noticed I seemed distant while we organized records together. Harold was 82 years old, the kind of person who notices everything. Something pressing on you, Commander. Family situation, I said. He nodded slowly, worst kind. Why is that? He thought about it for a moment. Because you can't put in for a transfer. I laughed harder than I had in months. As winter arrived, reports about Daniel grew increasingly pointed. The lake house renovations stopped. Contractors stopped returning calls. The grand renovation plans went quiet. The luxury vehicle remained, but most of the big announcements disappeared. Reality, which rarely knocks before entering, had apparently let itself in. Then came the phone call. The first one from Daniel in months. It came on a cold December evening while I was reading. I stared at his name on the screen for several seconds. Then I answered. Margaret. His voice sounded different, older, somehow, as though several years had accumulated since I'd last heard it. The confidence that had always been the loudest thing in the room was somewhere else tonight. What's going on? I asked. A long pause. I have a question. I waited. Did Dad ever mention anything to you about business loans? The question nearly made me smile. Years ago, yes, why? Another silence, then nothing, never mind. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but it told me precisely what I needed to know. The house of cards had begun to shift. Over the following weeks, accounts filtered in through family and mutual friends. Daniel was meeting with accountants. Daniel was consulting attorneys. Daniel was requesting financial records going back decades. Daniel was becoming frustrated in ways he hadn't been prepared for. One account particularly caught my attention. Daniel had apparently confronted Stephen Granger, the attorney who had orchestrated the estate paperwork, in a meeting that had not ended pleasantly. Daniel had demanded explanations. Stephen had insisted the documents were entirely valid. Daniel had threatened negligence claims. Stephen had reportedly responded with a sentence that Daniel could not find a satisfying answer to. "You signed exactly what you wanted signed." Around Christmas, I drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried. I do it every year. The cemetery sits on a quiet hillside outside Chesapeake, and in December it has a quality of stillness that I find more honest than comforting, but honest is its own kind of comfort. I stood at my mother's grave for a long time, holding winter flowers, talking to her the way people talk to the dead, not out loud, but internally in that private language grief creates. I found myself thinking about my parents' marriage, their individual failures and strengths, the particular way their relationship had shaped Daniel and me. For the first time, I found myself wondering whether my father had truly understood the financial maze he was leaving behind when he died, whether he had known what those obligations would do to whoever inherited them, whether some part of him had simply been relieved to pass the problem along to the living. The dead don't answer questions like that, but they ask them. January brought additional public filings, more obligations attached to the properties, nothing illegal, nothing fraudulent, just expensive, deeply, persistently expensive, the kind of expenses that transform an apparent fortune into something more closely resembling a burden with pleasant scenery. I spread everything across my dining room table one more time. Loan records, property filings, guarantee agreements, tax obligations, trust provisions, transfer agreements, cross-referenced and organized and dated. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Daniel had inherited every asset, and in doing so, under the language of the transfer agreement he had pressured me to sign, he had inherited every responsibility attached to those assets. The two were not separable. The agreement made that explicit for anyone who read it completely. The irony was almost architectural. If Daniel had divided the estate fairly, both of us would have shared the burden. The obligations would have been distributed. Instead, his determination to take everything had concentrated every benefit and every liability in a single place. He had wanted the entire bakery. Now he owned it, including every debt the baker had quietly accumulated over 30 years. The certified letter arrived in February, addressed to me, formally notifying me that remaining estate matters would be resolved at a final probate hearing. My presence was required. The date was 6 weeks away. I called my attorney that evening. His name was Michael Stratt. I had hired him months earlier, not for litigation, for protection. After reviewing the hearing notice, he asked me a straightforward question. "Are you prepared?" I looked at the neatly organized folders beside my desk. Every document, every record, every piece of verified evidence. "Yes." "You sound very certain." "I am." Michael paused thoughtfully. "I've noticed something about you, Margaret. You never sound this calm unless you're holding stronger cards than everyone else in the room." After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. The hearing was approaching, the moment Daniel had been engineering for nearly a year, the moment he believed would permanently cement his victory. What was strange was that I no longer felt angry. Hurt, yes, disappointed, certainly, but the anger had burned through itself months earlier and left something simpler in its place. Not satisfaction, not anticipation. Just a clear, even certainty that the truth was about to enter the room, and once it did, it would speak for itself. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold. Virginia winters have a particular talent for making everything feel quieter and more final. I left before sunrise and drove to Chesapeake with a thermos of coffee on the passenger seat and my organized folders on the back seat behind me. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in, watching my own breath. A year had passed since my father's death. 12 months of paperwork and discoveries and long nights at a dining room table. 12 months of watching assumptions travel toward their collision with reality. Inside, I found Michael near the courtroom entrance. He greeted me with a nod. "Sleep last night?" "A little." That's more than most people manage before a hearing like this. A few minutes later, Daniel arrived. I barely recognized the version of him who walked through those doors. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence that had filled every room he'd entered for the past year was cracked, still present in the expensive suit, the careful posture, but cracked. He looked tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. Stephen Granger walked beside him carrying his folders, looking equally unrefreshed. For a brief moment before we entered the courtroom, Daniel and I stood facing each other in the hallway. No attorneys speaking, no judge watching, no gallery of observers. Just two siblings standing in a courthouse hallway, which is about as unglamorous a place as any to confront a lifetime. Daniel broke the silence. You could have warned me. I held his gaze. Warned you about what? You know exactly what. I shook my head. Daniel, I genuinely don't, because I didn't cause the problem you're facing, I found it. Those are very different things. The hearing opened with procedural matters, estate summaries, legal clarifications, references to documents already on file. Routine in appearance, even slightly tedious from a distance. Beneath the surface, the tension was structural. About an hour in, discussion turned to the final transfer agreements. Stephen presented his position cleanly. Ownership had been legally transferred. The documents were valid. The estate distribution was complete and uncontestable. Simple, clean, finished. Then the judge asked whether any remaining concerns existed. Michael stood. There are, Your Honor. He approached methodically, without theater. He directed everyone's attention to specific language in the trust provisions, then to the transfer agreement itself, then to the paragraph, the one I'd found. Near midnight at my dining room table. The one stipulating that all obligations, liabilities, guarantees, encumbrances, and financial responsibilities attached to transferred assets were assumed in full by the receiving beneficiary. Not partially, in full, without exception. The judge adjusted his glasses and reread the provision, then reread it again. Stephen Granger leaned forward. Uncertainty, clean, unmistakable uncertainty, appeared on his face for what looked like the first time all morning. Daniel looked at his attorney. What does that mean? Stephen didn't answer immediately. Which was, as answers go, quite complete. Additional documents followed: property records, loan records, guarantee agreements that predated Daniel's ownership by decades, public filings, financial obligations tied directly to assets that now, legally and irrevocably, belong to my brother, presented one by one, methodically, without drama or accusation. Just evidence doing what evidence does when it's been properly assembled. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Not loudly, quietly, the way understanding settles into a room when the last piece of a picture snaps into place. I watched Daniel's face throughout. The progression was slow and private. Confusion, irritation, something harder. Something that looked, from where I sat, like a man watching a very comfortable assumption dissolve. Then came the moment I described at the beginning of the story. Daniel leaning back, trying to recover the air of a man who has already won, looking directly at me, telling me to enjoy retirement without a house. But you never finished reading the agreement, I said. The courtroom went still. The judge began asking questions. Specific, detailed, careful questions. Questions about the obligations attached to the transferred assets. Questions about the scope of the liability provisions. Questions about what exactly the Callaway Family Trust had encumbered and how those encumbrances transferred. Questions that became increasingly difficult for Daniel's side to answer. Because the answers were written in black ink on white paper, and they had been written there for everyone to read for a very long time. The judge reviewed the complete documentation one final time and issued his ruling. The transfer agreements were valid, the ownership transfers were valid, the associated obligations were valid, everything stood precisely as written. Daniel owned the estate, the family house, the lake property, the investment accounts, the business interests, every piece, and every financial responsibility connected to every piece of it. All of it, exactly as the agreement specified. The hearing ended, people gathered their papers, attorneys packed their briefcases. Life, as it tends to, continued forward. I remained in my seat for a moment, not triumphant, not relieved, just absorbing the particular quiet that follows resolution. For months, everyone had positioned me as the victim in this story. Perhaps I had been in the beginning, but somewhere between my dining room table at midnight and that courtroom on a gray February morning, the facts had replaced the assumptions. And facts, as I've learned over a lifetime, have a remarkable capacity to defend themselves. I looked across the courtroom. Daniel sat motionless, staring at the documents spread in front of him. For the first time in nearly a year, he wasn't looking at a fortune. He was looking at the truth, and it weighed considerably more than he'd expected. People imagine that stories like this end with a verdict. A courtroom moment, a defeated adversary, music swelling, credits rolling. Real life continues past the ending people imagine for it. The weeks following the hearing were oddly quiet. I returned to Richmond, resumed my Tuesdays and Thursdays at the Veterans Center, worked in my garden, bought groceries, paid bills. Ordinary life, which is what most of life actually is. Daniel, meanwhile, was beginning a very different chapter. The financial obligations attached to the estate didn't dissolve because a judge had issued a ruling. If anything, they became more concrete. Loan restructuring discussions accelerated. Property valuations were ordered. Creditors were owed responses. Banks were owed documentation. Tax authorities were owed compliance. None of them were interested in family narratives. They were interested in numbers, and numbers have no patience for sentiment. By April, I heard the lake property had been listed for sale. That news arrived through a former neighbor, and it landed harder than I expected. The lake property had been in our family for decades. I remembered my father teaching me to fish there when I was 9 or 10, one of the rare, uncomplicated afternoons from a childhood that didn't offer many of them. I remembered my mother sitting on the dock with a novel, her hair pushed back from her face, looking more relaxed than she ever seemed indoors. I remembered birthday. Why cookouts and summer afternoons and photographs that would now all be in someone else's past. Soon it would belong to strangers. The thought saddened me in a way that surprised me, not because I wanted the property, but because it represented the permanent closing of something. Not a chapter, an era. The family house was listed shortly afterward. I hadn't expected that to hit as hard as it did. That house had been standing for more than 50 years. Every significant moment of my childhood was located somewhere inside its walls. Christmas mornings, arguments that went on for days, dinners that didn't. The exact spot in the kitchen where my mother stood when she told me she was proud of me. One of only 2 or 3 times in my life that phrase came from inside that house, and I had been holding it ever since. Now it was a real estate listing, with a yard sign visible from the street. One evening I found myself driving through Chesapeake without having planned to, drawn by some gravitational pull I didn't entirely understand. I parked across the street from the house and sat with the engine running for nearly 20 minutes, watching, remembering, grieving not for the building itself but for the time it contained. Time, I've come to understand, is the only inheritance that cannot be transferred, cannot be disputed, cannot be reclaimed once spent. By early summer, Daniel's circumstances had quietly changed. The social landscape around him had shifted. Success draws people toward you. Difficulty reveals which of them were actually there. Several of the friends who had celebrated his inheritance with him the previous year were increasingly absent. The invitations slowed. The phone calls became infrequent. The admiration dissolved into something more uncomfortable. Then came the afternoon. I opened my door and found Daniel standing there. 3 months had passed since the hearing. He looked older, not dramatically so, but worn down, the way a person looks when they haven't slept with any peace in a long time. His expensive coat looked less purposeful than it once had. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped back, of course. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where, months earlier, I had discovered the clause that changed everything. Neither of us mentioned that. Daniel stared at his coffee cup for a long time before finding the right words. "Did you know?" he asked finally. "When you signed, did you already know what was in those documents?" I thought carefully before answering. He deserved honesty. Given everything, maybe he deserved it more than anyone. "No, not when I signed. I discovered it afterward. He looked up from his cup. I was certain you'd planned the whole thing, he said quietly. I understand why you thought that, but no. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a bird moved through the oak tree in the yard. Ordinary sounds, happening in ordinary time, indifferent to what was being said inside. Daniel rubbed his face slowly. You want to know what's strange? What? I spent years believing Dad trusted me more than you. That staying meant I'd won something. A short, humorless exhale, and I spent most of my adult life acting like it. The words hung between us, painfully honest and deeply familiar, and arriving about 40 years later than either of us needed them to. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about courts or documents or money, about our mother, about summers at the lake, about the particular quality of silence that filled our father's house when he was in a dark mood, about the way he compared us, not always consciously, not always cruelly, but persistently, as if his children were a competition he was running for purposes nobody had explained to us. I thought if I accumulated enough victories, Daniel said at one point, quietly, almost to himself, eventually I'd feel like I actually mattered to him. I recognized that sentence. I recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting on a page you'd forgotten you wrote. Because beneath everything, the manipulation, the legal maneuvering, the cruelty of that courtroom smile, there was a man who had spent his entire life chasing approval from someone who had never learned to give it freely. The same chase I had run. We had simply chosen different tracks. Understanding a person isn't the same as forgiving them. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. But understanding does something to the shape of old anger. It changes the geometry of it, makes it harder to sustain. Before he left, Daniel paused at the front door with the look of someone carrying a sentence he'd been rehearsing. I was wrong, he said, about most of it. I know. After he was gone, I sat alone for a long time watching the late afternoon light move across my kitchen floor. The revenge I had once imagined I wanted, the triumph, the definitive moment of vindication, had long since stopped feeling like what I actually needed. The estate was dissolving. The properties were leaving our family. The money was diminishing. None of it had produced happiness for anyone, not for my father, who had spent decades building it on complicated foundations. Not for Daniel, who had seized it and found it heavier than he'd imagined. Not for me, who had spent a year fighting to understand it. What remained was something far more complicated and far more valuable than any of the things the lawyers had argued over. 2 aging siblings, a lifetime of accumulated misunderstandings, and perhaps, for the very first time, the possibility of simply stopping. One Saturday in early autumn, nearly a year after the final hearing, Daniel arrived at my door carrying a small wooden box. It was old, handmade, the kind of thing that lives on closet shelves for decades without anyone remembering it's there. He set it on my dining room table without much explanation and opened the lid. Inside were photographs, letters, military documents, birthday cards in my mother's handwriting, family keepsakes, the kind of things that outlast money and property and legal agreements because they're not attached to anything that can be claimed or transferred. They simply exist. For a moment, we both just looked. Then I noticed a photograph tucked near the side of the box. My mother, standing beside me at my Navy commissioning ceremony. I couldn't have been more than 22. She was smiling in the photograph the way she smiled in person, with her whole face, with her eyes, with something in her posture that said she was simply glad to be exactly where she was. I had forgotten this photograph existed. I picked it up carefully. Daniel found another, the 4 of us at the lake property. My father looked younger, almost relaxed. My mother looked genuinely happy. Daniel and I looked sunburned and slightly squinting at the camera. We both laughed, the first real laugh we'd shared in longer than either of us could precisely calculate. For hours we sat at that table sorting through what the box contained. Each item unlocked something. A report card in my mother's handwriting, with her note in the margin. A postcard I'd sent home from a deployment overseas. A short letter from my father that I hadn't known existed. Gerald Calloway had not been a man who wrote down his feelings. Reading his handwriting in a letter felt slightly startling, like hearing a voice you'd assumed had gone silent forever. The letter covered ordinary things, property matters, a note about a neighbor. But near the end, one line stopped me entirely. Take care of each other when I'm gone. I read it twice, then I passed it to Daniel. He read it silently, neither of us spoke. Two people who had spent nearly a year fighting over an inheritance. Two people who had nearly destroyed a relationship that was the only one of its kind either of us would ever have. And buried inside a forgotten wooden box, in handwriting neither of us had seen in months, a simple instruction. Take care of each other. The sun began to lower outside while we were still sitting there, and neither of us seemed in any particular hurry to leave. So we carried the box onto the back porch and continued in the evening air while the neighborhood settled into its quiet autumn rhythms. At some point, Daniel held up a photograph of our father. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, I spent most of my life trying to impress him. I looked out at the yard. So did I. I don't think it was ever possible. No, I said, I don't think it was. The competition that had defined our entire relationship, the invisible contest our father had created, and we had both agreed to run, was finally, genuinely over. Not because one of us had won, because there was nothing left to win. The estate was nearly gone. The properties were gone. Most of the money was gone. And without those things at the center of it, the competition revealed itself for what it had always been. Two children trying to be chosen by someone who had never quite learned how to choose. Before Daniel left, he picked up the wooden box and held it out to me. Keep it, he said. Are you sure? He nodded. Mom would have wanted you to have it. After he was gone, I stayed on the porch while the first stars appeared above the tree line. The evening was cool and still. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then went quiet. The neighborhood sounded like neighborhoods sound, ordinary, unhurried, indifferent to the particular weight of any individual evening. A year after the final hearing, very little remained of the Callaway estate. The lake property had sold to a family from Roanoke. The family house belonged to a young couple who were already painting the rooms. The investment accounts had been largely liquidated to meet outstanding obligations. The complicated financial arrangements my father had constructed over decades had consumed much of what had appeared, from a distance, to be a substantial fortune. If you evaluated this story by its financial outcome, you might conclude it was a tragedy for everyone involved. But numbers have never told the whole story of anything. I am 68 years old. Retirement has settled into a life that is quiet and purposeful and genuinely mine. Not glamorous, not large, just peaceful. And after everything that happened in the year following my father's death, peaceful feels like the most underrated thing a person can have. One afternoon at the Veterans Center, a Korean War veteran named Harold paused while we were filing records and said, almost to no one in particular, when you're young, you think life is about accumulation, collecting things, building things up. I kept working. What changes? He shrugged with the economy of someone who has thought about it for a long time. Eventually, you understand that most of it is just practice for letting go. I thought about those words for the entire drive home. The inheritance, the anger, the documents spread across my dining room table at midnight, the courtroom on a gray February morning, the wooden box on my back porch, the photograph of my mother at my commissioning ceremony. One by one, over the course of a year, I had been letting things go, not surrendering them, releasing them. There's a difference that matters. Daniel and I are not close in the way siblings in movies are close. Life doesn't typically offer that. But the hostility is gone, replaced by something quieter and more durable. We have lunch occasionally. We call on birthdays. Once, last spring, we drove out to the lake property, which belongs to someone else now, and parked near the road and looked at it for a while without speaking. Then we drove back, and stopped for coffee, and talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular. It was one of the better afternoons I can remember. The most valuable thing I received from my family's estate was never listed in any document. It wasn't protected by any trust provision. No court would ever have awarded it to anyone. It was the understanding that some burdens are not worth carrying forever, and some victories are not worth winning. My father left us a complicated machine. Daniel and I both made serious mistakes in how we handled it, Daniel through greed, me through insufficient caution. What neither of us anticipated was that the machine would strip away everything we'd been fighting over and leave us standing in the same place we'd started. Two people who shared a childhood, who both wanted to be loved by a man who expressed love poorly, who spent decades running a race neither of us had ever chosen to enter. The estate is gone. What remains is something neither my father's, well, nor my brother's attorney could have given or taken away. If you've stayed with me through this story, I imagine you may have experienced something similar in your own life. A family conflict, an old wound, a relationship that became a competition without anyone consciously deciding it should. If so, I hope this offers one small, useful thing. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive when you finally defeat someone. It arrives when you finally decide to stop fighting a battle that no longer serves anyone. Take care of each other. That was all he asked. It was, in the end, the only inheritance that mattered. If this story stayed with you, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts. Have you ever watched a family be pulled apart by money, or pride, or old wounds that were never allowed to heal? And if you found your way back to something better, even something partial, even something quiet, perhaps your story could help someone else find their footing. Thank you for spending this time with me.